Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. Welcome to the sixth and final installment of our virtual event series produced in partnership with the Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP, Promise over Peril, which looks at the realities and risks of artificial intelligence. My name is Amy McKinnon. I'm a national security and intelligence reporter with Foreign Policy, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Today's conversation, the AI era of intelligence, will focus on the opportunities and challenges that generative AI presents for the intelligence community. AI has the potential to transform the way the intelligence community works, offering new and more efficient ways to search and act upon the vast quantities of information made available by the digital age. However, it also offers opportunities for adversaries and non-state actors to explore new avenues for disruption through disinformation, cyber attacks, and their own intelligence gathering operations. The stakes are high and the technology is advancing rapidly. With all that in mind, we have convened some leading experts and former senior intelligence leaders to discuss how the IC can keep apace with this rapidly evolving information landscape. And before I dive in, I would like to extend a huge thank you to SCSP for helping make this event series possible. We also want to hear from you wherever in the world you are joining us from. We have reserved a portion of our conversation today for questions from you, our global audience. You will see on screen now some instructions on how to join in with the conversation. If you're watching the live stream on our website, you can click the button below to submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, your organization, or your affiliation, and where in the world you're writing from. If you're on social media, you can chime in using the hashtag #PromiseOverPeril, or you can email us your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com. Okay, so let's get started. To begin with, I am delighted to be joined by Dan Breedlove, the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Emerging and Disruptive Technologies with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Amy. Good to see you. And thank you to SCSP and FP for the invite today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm hoping you can start by setting the scene for us. There is a lot to discuss with this conversation, and I'm hoping you can give us the kind of 10,000-foot view before we zoom in and get a little bit more granular. So taking a step back in history, AI is not necessarily all that new. The race for AI supremacy goes back to the days of the Cold War. I remember my reporting looking through declassified documents in the CIA's reading room and finding reports about the Soviet Union's AI capabilities going as far back as the 1960s. So what is it about this moment? Why are we having this conversation now? What is different about this moment that we are in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really fascinating question. So as you said, looking back to the 50s and the 60s and kind of this post-World War II era, we saw this strong Soviet interest in AI, or what they may have called cybernetics or even machine mathematics at the time. And during that time, Soviets aimed to automate decision-making processes through the use of intelligent machines. It was seen as a way to plan, monitor, manage complex national systems for societal benefit in line with communist ideology. However, there were also some drawbacks, which they recognized a leading role in the West, especially with computing power, and Soviet specialists had to walk a fine line with what they may have described as two, quote, mortal dangers. So one being further falling behind the West in computing, and two, following Western trends too closely, which could be a danger to their ideology. You could argue that there are some hints there in what we're seeing today as well. So what really is different about today, to get more directly after your question? The answer is there's a lot that's different, especially compared to the Cold War. First, I'd say the introduction of GPUs. It's hard to ignore the parallel processing capabilities and how they relate to high-performance computers. Thinking back to Andrew Ng's paper from 2009, just using parallel processing and unsupervised learning, getting 70 times faster speed-ups when compared to CPUs. There's just this efficiency that's inherent in a lot of what is going on in the AI world today. Second is data. Some of you may have seen the statistics that as much as 90% of the data generated in the last 2 years alone eclipses that of all of humanity before that. However, there's also this kind of conflict that only some estimate that 0.5% of the data that we have access to is actually utilized, analyzed in AI today. So there's kind of this big data piece, which really feeds into the training and testing of algorithms. That's also fairly new. Third, I'd say the explosion of talent and know-how. Countless universities now have AI programs across the world, China, the US, you name it, at all levels from undergrad all the way up to the PhD level, which further drives development through academia, which feeds into industry and beyond. I'd say software and frameworks as well. When you think about PyTorch, TensorFlow, China's model, Paddle, the big one there, are world-class, kind of foundationalizing knowledge and bringing everyone to the table in a more rapid manner, kind of leveling skill sets across the board more quickly. Thinking about algorithms, convolutional neural networks often used in computer vision and mass surveillance, for example. Those have not been around, but for maybe a decade, really, in their current form. So that's also fairly new. The clouds that brings everything together. And just in the last 18 months or so, I mean, we're all witnessing, the large language model craze, the chatbots, the ChatGPT type tools, all of these things coming together that I already mentioned in a way combined with a rather simplistic, I'd say, user interface that has really expedited this AI phase that we're currently in. And I think you see that in areas like what some are terming AI for science and engineering, or the AI plus, or even the fifth scientific revolution, or the fifth paradigm of scientific discovery. So it's really AI converging with everything right now. It's AI plus biotechnology, it's AI plus microelectronics, it's AI plus material science. It's all of those other fields that are really converging with AI very quickly. That I think makes this a very exciting time overall.
So just to continue on that theme of this being an exciting time, I mean, as the name of this event suggests, promise over peril, AI has both opportunities and challenges, particularly when it comes to the world of intelligence. Let's start on the optimistic note. What are some of the opportunities for this? How can this assist the work of intelligence agencies?
Yeah, so when we think about the work that intelligence agencies do, we think about analysis, collections, and then a lot of business practices as well. And having spoken with ODNI's Science and Technology Group, which thinks specifically about how AI could augment IC workflows, there are several areas worth initially mentioning, though it's not my specific role to go in depth in any of these areas specifically. So first, for analysis, obviously, AI could be used to help see things differently, kind of broaden analysts' minds on how they see their AORs, obviously with a human more likely in or on the loop, not just finding needles in haystacks, but the needles in the needle stacks, so getting after some very specific data. And also just really overall helping with velocity and veracity when resolving entities. So again, just kind of understanding and seeing their AORs differently, coming to better conclusions, and really helping our customers out better than ever.
Can you elaborate on what AOR is for our audience?
Area of responsibility. So if an analyst follows a certain type of weapon system, for example, maybe help them see that weapon system a little bit differently. I would also bring a recent study that I read into the mix here. I think I read this from Harvard, that experts, when they use large language models within the bounds of what these large language models are designed to do, experts predict that there may be as much as 40% increases in efficiency for those experts when doing their job. So that could be a big deal for the intelligence community and well beyond as well. Second, it's not just analysis again, but I'd also like to mention just really business practices, which everyone has to deal with, whether you're an analyst, collector, or in other fields as well. So creating initial draft documents, again, for human review, doing graphical type work, logos, that can be a cumbersome process, which there's room for efficiency there. Reviewing and formatting slides, a lot of analysts and others have to create slides and give presentations on a daily basis. Kind of going through that process can be very tedious at times. There may be room for AI to help them through that process and much, much more. However, whatever the case is, I think it's important to note that ODNI is going all in on the policy, ethics, and appropriate guidance for IC members to consider when using AI tools. And I know we have a lot to cover here, but due to limited time and again, mentioning ODNI's Science and Technology Group, they may have more insight to offer down the road.
Great. And then getting to, looking to the broader world, I mean, what are some ways in which adversaries or non-state actors are looking to utilize AI, and what are the challenges that they could pose?
Yeah, and there are a lot of areas to discuss here. This is another really good question, Amy. Certainly misinformation, disinformation, and I'd say weaving in deep fakes is on the list. There's a statistic that came out recently. A multinational organization in 2023 reported that there's been a significant tenfold increase in the number of deepfakes detected globally across all industries from just 2022 to 2023 alone, with notable regional differences. So North America kind of led the way with a 1,740% deepfake surge, followed by 1,530% in APAC, 780% in Europe, 450% in the Middle East and Africa, 410% in Latin America. So I'm sure there are a lot of gray areas in some of these statistics, and it's hard to really understand the data sets from our perspective anyways. But it just kind of, I think, confirms the trend that misinformation, disinformation, and deepfakes are becoming a big problem. And two areas where you might break this down even further, I'd say one is elections. So the ability to rapidly produce realistic content in multiple languages is expected to increase foreign actors' propaganda capabilities, especially in 2024. And some of you may have seen the statistics that this is kind of an unprecedented year for elections when 2 billion voters across 50 countries will vote in record-breaking number of not just presidential elections, but parliamentary, legislative elections as well around the world. And then second, I think wartime environments. So the deep fake or quote cheap fake of President Zelensky comes to mind in 2022 when he asked Ukrainian troops to lay down arms in a video in social media, which he had to come out later that day and say that was actually not him and for his Ukrainian troops to keep fighting the Russian troops. Second area, kind of building on that military applications piece, I should highlight the importance of the human-machine interaction for the military especially, and kind of leveraging AI in an attempt to generate possible tactical and strategic advantage. Three focus areas that we've seen in just unclassed military reporting may include human decision-making again, so kind of enhancing the commander's decision-making, understanding of the battlefield and possible options for action. Second, network offensive and defensive warfare, independently writing computer code and program codes. And then the third piece is military logistics. So kind of stepping away from the battlefield, but seeing the whole military enterprise in a different way and the efficiency and kind of the end-to-end logistics cycles and efficiency. However, when we get to military, it's always important to keep in mind trust and the trust of machines to make decisions with varying levels of human in, on, or outside the loop. And then the last piece I mentioned in this question is digital surveillance and sovereignty. So according to open source, the increasing sophistication and spread of AI and digital surveillance technologies has drawn concerns over privacy and human rights. And further, these technologies are used in a range of settings. So some of the most severe use cases include helping to spy on political dissidents, enabling repression of Uyghur and Muslim populations across China, for example. However, it goes well beyond that. Concerns also arise in mundane cases as well, which you have to consider, such as one-to-one verification at banks and gyms and so forth. A higher quality and probably quantity of the data collection can help companies and governments improve their facial recognition technologies over time and use them elsewhere for authoritarian purposes.
That's a daunting array of challenges there. I mean, what does in the realm of AI, what does a Sputnik moment look like? What is something that either a foreign government or a non-state actor could develop or utilize, which is the kind of thing that would make you and your colleagues sit up and say, this is a quantum leap moment, this is a qualitatively different level of threat?
Yeah, to answer this question, Amy, I think this is another just really good question. We have to take a step back and recognize our biases, and that's something we're trained to do in the IC, and just realize that our adversaries have different approaches for using large language models, for bringing them into their workflows, whether it's civilian or military or intelligence or whatever. And we really just need to consider that their approach, their application will be different. When I mentioned earlier about AI for science and engineering is, I think, one of the most fascinating areas that is probably worth bringing into the mix again, because when you think about AI expediting the other science and engineering fields, whether it's designing a technology, whether it's getting at a science and engineering field at the most granular level possible, thinking, chemistry, physics, that type of level, all the way up to the very highest systems engineering level as well. Everything from both extremes has the opportunity to be optimized, new technologies and processes to be discovered, et cetera. So while I hesitate to say there is one Sputnik moment that comes to mind, I think there are many opportunities for, I don't want to say a quantum leap, but just the rate of discovery changing in all of these fields, which could lead to, I'd say, more complexity and potentially some surprises in the future.
So we only have a couple of minutes left in our discussion. And it feels unfair to throw probably one of the biggest topics into the last 2 minutes, but I would be remiss, I think, if we didn't touch upon China. If you could just briefly, how does China's development of AI compare to the US? What are their strengths in this field versus what you're seeing in the United States?
Yeah, so again, recognizing that it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison of China versus US, and that it's not my job specifically to analyze the US anyways. I have my authorities and I don't want to cross those. When we look at China, we do recognize some strengths that they have. Two come to mind. One would be mass surveillance, large scale surveillance. And two, their application, their ability to move fast in applying technology breakthroughs made elsewhere into their kind of own unique ecosystem. So for surveillance, some of you may have read the annual threat assessment that ODNI released in February of this year. In that document, we state that Chinese AI firms are already world leaders in voice and image recognition, video analytics, and mass surveillance technologies. And furthermore, China leads the world in applying surveillance and censorship to monitor its population and repress dissent. On the application side, so taking what the breakthroughs may be in the Western world, for example, and applying those in China, you can look at maybe an example of that with some of the current Chinese large language model companies, which have some reference to Western companies and their code, for example, that's come out in the press. They're under tremendous pressure just to keep abreast of US innovations and kind of follow suit. So one open source researcher had stated that ChatGPT actually to China may have been a Sputnik moment for them and kind of got them in gear to follow closely more than ever. But really, when I think you want to compare the US versus China, one interesting way to do that is through the rapidly evolving world in benchmarking. And there's no concrete way that I've seen to do this, though there are some industry leaders in academia as well, where if you look at Stanford, for example, it's Helm benchmark, HELM. They have this structure where they test large language models from around the world: US, China, France, Germany, Israel, Canada, and the UAE all come into the mix in their top 30. And when you look at how that breaks down, there's the top 5, I think, are US models. Number 6 is that Chinese model, which may be based off a US model. and then those other countries come into the mix in the top 30 as well. So the challenge there is just keeping pace with the rapid changes. And while it is kind of a U.S. versus China discussion in many people's eyes, I would just mention what I found fascinating, a recent FP article that in the AI race, it's not really China and the U.S. AI maybe winning the AI race. So we need to think broadly, just beyond the U.S. and China, to all these other countries as well, and how AI can help really anyone drive innovation. And again, it's an exciting environment that we're witnessing right now.
Thank you, Dan, for setting the scene for us there. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise. I'm now going to bring in our panelists for a panel discussion, continuing our conversation. I am delighted to be joined by Sue Gordon, President of Gordon Ventures and former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Chip Usher, Senior Director for Intelligence at SCSP, and Dr. Anthony Vici, Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. So I guess we should dive in. I'm very excited to discuss this with you all, because I know you have a lot to say on this topic, and hopefully our audience will be hearing the least from me. I want to start with you, Sue. As Dan alluded to, there's an incredible amount of work being done on this, particularly in the academic space, in the private sector in Silicon Valley, and that really accessing that cutting edge of potential of AI is going to necessitate some collaboration between the government and the private sector. And I know that this is something you have done a lot of work on throughout your career. What does that relationship look like? How receptive is Silicon Valley to working with the government, and particularly with the IC, and what can be done to kind of foster that collaboration?
Well, great question. This is up to me to answer that 4-hour question in 4 minutes so that we have time for discussion. And thanks to FP and SCSP for having us, and great to see you, Amy, and to be here with my friends and colleagues, Chip and Anthony. Okay, so I'll kind of go with the Maslow's hierarchy. Number one is, this is really important to the intelligence community, because using information for advantage in all the ways Dan mentioned is actually our stock in trade. And so those technologies that help with that are super important for that reason. That's the whole game of intelligence. Second, I'm old, so I think I can say this with assurance. I don't think there's a single thing that the intelligence community has done without the benefit of the private sector. Right? So partnership with the private sector is not a new idea. Interesting, though, if you look at the arc of how we did it, was kind of depending on the time. If you think of FFRDCs, the idea was let's get a bunch of talent and have it available for use. And you think about Lockheed Skunk Works, let's go to a company and have them develop something for us. And you mentioned Silicon Valley. So in the late 90s, the idea is, we need to give undifferentiated funds to a VC-like entity to make investments so that things would be developed that are useful to our need, but commercially successful. And so you have In-Q-Tel. So the idea is how you do that partnership depends on the environment in which you find yourself. So thinking about why you need that, it's especially important, I think, in these power over peril kind of technologies where you need what both bring. So the private sector brings this just explosion in energy and input and possibility and speed and market forces that are their own energy. But these technologies, market forces alone won't be enough to ensure that what we get at the end is what we need. And that's where national security comes in, right? And it's always been an important part of technology development, is the understanding that national security brings to how you manage risk and get something that is actually usable and successful. So I think we need the private sector and market forces, but that isn't enough. You need the risk management understanding that national security tends to bring, particularly at scale, and consideration of other things. But control, which is the government's favorite mechanism, isn't going to be enough, because it could run the risk of slowing it to the point that you lose the advantage in this really competitive world that you need. Your last question is kind of what's the mood? So I think the mood's always been okay. I think the private sector in Silicon Valley certainly recognizes the need of the national security community and the intelligence community, and the desire of the fact that they have big problems, and that's interesting, and they're willing to work with them. I think we've kind of gone through the make sure that everyone is ensuring the public trust. The one thing, and this is just a personal note, that the private sector I think is a little frustrated with is the government needs to give a little bit of direction, needs to signal clear intention, and needs to get on with the actual business of partnering with them to deliver outcome, not just looking at technology. And the private sector needs to recognize that this is not a world where you can throw a capability over the transom and expect the government to do all the work of integrating into their environment. So there you go. 4 minutes of a 4-hour discussion.
Thank you very much for that overview, Sue. It was very, very succinct. Anthony, I want to bring you in now. I mean, one of the interesting things, and I imagine one of the challenges for the IC when it comes to AI is this is not a plug and play technology. You cannot take ChatGPT, train it on the information that the government has, and just start running it in-house. What are some of the considerations that the IC has when looking to take, privately developed technologies, either use it in-house or to kind of bring this technology over the transom from kind of private into government world?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for having me to the FP and to SCSP, and thanks for getting the band back together with Sue and I, and good to see Chip as well. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the most important, most obvious answer is around security. So the intelligence community is typically operating in classified environments, whereas most of the current GenAI systems are operating on an open cloud infrastructure. And obviously the IC can't do that. They can't release their data onto that. They can't even release the questions that they would want to ask the system, because as soon as you ask a question, you're kind of tipping off the adversary of what you're interested in, which itself is often classified. So for use in the IC, you need to secure these systems, which means you need to essentially put them onto a classified cloud or a classified data center system. That's actually not quite as different as I think some of the commercial requirements are, though. And I know a lot of banks and other institutions don't want to have their data shared, their question shared, either because maybe there's trade secrets or proprietary information, or there's personally identifiable information. So the issue isn't quite as separate from commercial as you might think, but the IC is just at this extreme form of it. So that's the primary answer. But really quickly, I'd also bring up a secondary, which is the kinds of questions that the IC is going to ask are different in some fundamental ways from what commercial industry would ask, and where the directionality of some of these technologies are going. A lot of the GenAI examples you see out there right now are maybe consumer focused, kind of general questions. You want to be able to interact and kind of ask for information, maybe brainstorm. Maybe you look at something like Sora, where you're starting to ask it to make videos and things like this. Those are amazing examples of the use of AI, and I think we all find them fascinating. But the kinds of questions that the IC are going to ask, they're very specific. They're very detailed, and the answers have to be very specific and detailed and real. They can't be kind of the general information, and the answers have to be immediate. And a lot of the Gen AI systems, because of the training cycles behind them, are answering with information that might be a year or more old, whereas the IC is going to ask a question today, and maybe even the last hour, the last minute, the last second. So there are some differences, I think, in how the IC is going to use and interact with these things. But what's promising for me, as somebody who's been in the IC, seen the requirements, I can see a pathway for some of these commercial companies, those capabilities to be brought over to the classified side and to be able to answer these kinds of questions that the IC is going to need answered.
So they essentially need near real-time data inputs going in if you're going to use it to ask these kind of detailed questions. But I mean, one of the I think fascinating things about AI is if I go into GPT and ask it a question or ask it to generate something, it can do a very good job of it, but it can't tell me how it reached that answer, where that came from. It doesn't come with footnotes. What problem does that present when using it in intelligence?
Sure, the black box issue that you can't untangle, and really the IC has been tackling this for several years now. Even with kind of traditional machine learning based artificial intelligence, it was the same problem. It's sort of fundamental to this approach to AI that is more or less taken over in the last 8 to 10 years. And there's been a lot of work done by DARPA and other organizations to try to figure out how you make what is sometimes called explainable AI, how you can interrogate the black box AI systems to figure out how it came to an answer. Now, I'll say this though, human brains are also black boxes sometimes, and you can't always interrogate how someone came up with a creative idea connected to pieces of information, and especially when you think about human intelligence as one of the feeds into all source intelligence, you don't always know. So the IC isn't as unaccustomed to this as some people make it out, but I do think you're right to bring it up as another example of something where the IC is going to need explainability. Other organizations will as well, law enforcement, banking and finance, and anyone that is making decisions that have real ramifications and are complex, they're also going to need explainability. But the IC, again, is just on this extreme end of that spectrum of requiring that kind of explainability.
Chip, I want to bring you in now. I mean, how do you envision? Well, I know that AI is already being developed and deployed within the IC, but how will this be integrated within the workforce? Do you expect it's going to complement the work of existing analysts? Are there entire tasks that can now just be done entirely by AI? I'm just curious, how is it going to change the way that intelligence is organized and analyzed and written up?
A great question, Amy, and thank you for the opportunities to speak with you today. And it's a real pleasure to join Anthony and Sue, such an august group. I feel pretty intimidated, but here at SESP, we've been doing some deep thinking about how generative artificial intelligence actually is going to merge into particularly the all source analytic mission. Over the last few months, we've been partnering with our friends down in Australia and the ASPE Institute, and have been convening experts from the intelligence community, Daniel's colleagues, along with some of the large language model developers and other technologists for a conversation. And I think what we will see, we're beginning to see now, and the first stages of this will be kind of integrating generative AI tools into the analytic workflows. And there are several junctures where generative AI can make a real difference. We talked a little bit earlier about the utility of AI for search and identifying patterns. This is fundamental to what machine learning can do, and is already being applied in some instances, but I think you'll see that expand. So bringing in massive amounts of data from various data sets and arriving at insight and identifying patterns will be accelerated, but it won't stop there. Analysts then need to think about, how do they present their information? How do they craft their assessment? Does it adhere to analytic tradecraft standards? And again, generative AI can be a tool, an aid, if you will, for an analyst as they begin to conceptualize and produce their product. And then towards the back end of that process, when it comes to understanding the customer requirements, what are the key intelligence questions that our senior policymakers have? AI can assist in that interface, speed it up, make those questions and those requests more immediately available, provide feedback more quickly to analysts. And then finally, as the IC sits back and it tries to assess the performance of units, of individuals over time, AI will be another assistant, a training aid, a teaching aid, a management aid. So there'll be all sorts of junctures where we see generative AI as having a real impact.
And staying with you, Chip, how do you ensure that things like ethical standards and legal standards are integrated when using AI? If you're at the NSA and you're running a query on signals intelligence, how do you make sure that it, it picks up the right stuff, and that it's not overstraying the remits of the organization?
Yeah, this is some of the real spade work that's going to need to be done with some urgencies, starting a few months ago, but really pressing over the next 12 months to 2 years. We have the administration's executive order, which told agencies to designate AI leads. That's a good start. We're anticipating a National Security Council, National Security memo that will define the parameters or set the rules, broadly speaking, for how national security departments and agencies can apply AI. But there's some tough questions. These large language models are largely built from the internet, as we've heard. 60, 70% of that data is built from, US sources. So there's a lot of US persons data that goes into the training of these large language models. As the IC starts to explore them, what are the rules for whether they can use them for experimentation and testing? But then if they actually want to deploy them and use them in real world instances, and the model is trained from US persons information, how is that going to be adjudicated? And these are some tough issues that are going to need to be sorted out here before the IC really can accelerate and make full use of these systems. Some potential workarounds or ways that they can mitigate some of those risks exist. Taking open source models, fiddling with them, and just applying them to classified data sources is one route to take. But they may not perform at the same level of what we will see in the years ahead coming from some of these closed systems. They'll be increasing their capability, 10, 100-fold over the next few years. So to really stay at the cutting edge, some of these rules of the road need to be worked out.
Thanks, Chip. And before I continue, I just want to remind our audience that you can submit your own questions to our distinguished guests today using the chat box if you're joining us live on the website or on social media using the hashtag #PromiseOverPeril. Sue, I want to come back to you. To be honest, I sometimes struggle to get my head around AI because it is so expansive, and it's a little bit like asking, what is the internet? Well, the answer is, well, it depends what you use it for. You can use it to watch Netflix, you can use it to keep in touch with your loved ones, you can use it for disinformation campaigns and all kinds of horrible things. So I want to kind of throw you a really broad question. When you think about AI in the IC, what are the top 3 things that you have top of mind that you think we need to do this, or this is the biggest challenge, or what are just your focal points when it comes to AI?
Oh, what a great question. So what I thought Dan did a really nice job of talking about the whole spectrum of the potential uses, from the seemingly pedantic of administrative processes that allow you to move at speed or just make them more efficient in general, which has a real advantage, to being able to find disinformation, and then in the middle, basically the enablement of everything. I'd probably start at what intelligence really is about knowing the truth, seeing beyond the horizon, and allowing leaders to act before events dictate. And I think AI, in terms of allowing us to both use more information, understand it better, find the patterns, distinguish true from false, have real potential on that first piece of it's not the truth, it's the best picture of what is and the advantage that provides. Seeing beyond the horizon is really those patterns of things that have the potential to do everything from identifying intent early to identifying advantage, and then allowing leaders to act before events dictate. It's enabling that speed with more confidence than they might, because I think each one of the people who have spoken talked about intelligence when it's its best is the craft that allows people to deal with fundamental uncertainty as though there is certainty. And that's true whether it's a human making an assessment of the best judgment they can make, or whether that's using machines to do it that well. So I think it's in that piece of information that it can provide its greatest advantage. I also think it's really leaping into the fray of assurance. I think what we've learned as a nation is this national security is really the responsibility of all of us. And what's cool about AI, if it is really prosecuted for use by the intelligence and national security communities, it will drive the development of things that benefit all of society, right? And so embracing that responsibility to be able to imbue in these technologies things that allow us to have confidence in the information quality that is so pervasive as a societal need, I think is really urgent, not just for its own use, but also for national security writ large. And then the last is applying it to understand and potentially counter what our adversaries are doing, because I think sometimes we forget that we're not just doing this as an academic exercise about how we most are comfortable having advantage. It's that the other people out there now have access to technologies. And the question is, how do you put it to use better? So around the judgments we make, around the assurance that we provide, and around the understanding of adversaries and competitors who would advance their interests through information quality.
I threw that question at you cold, and I have to say that was a fantastic overview on
You
the
did,
spot.
and we'll talk about that later.
Thank you, Sue. We have a question from the audience, and it's on public and private sector relations. So I'll stick with you as we began with you on this question. This comes from Melissa Nix, who works in tech and is based in Arlington, just down the road from us. Melissa asks, how do you get the private and public sector, including nation states with various agendas, many of whom may be adversaries or competing with us, to sign on to responsible use of AI regulation and governance structures? Melissa mentions the early atomic age, or NPT comes to mind. Is that possible or desired, especially as AI is advancing so rapidly?
So I alluded to this in my first answer, Melissa. I think it is one of the questions of the day, and that is the solution to this is recognizing that we require the partnership of the government and the private sector, and that when you do that, neither one has it isn't to any of our collective advantage to either one to dictate how they want it done based on their own advantage. In other words, you have to think of the outcome you need. You need to share your values and then be more open-minded in the implementation. Just a silly example, not in this area, is back in the early 30s, when after the stock market crash, we realized that what was going on in the private sector was a necessary element of national security. The SEC was formed. But when the SEC that had the regulatory authority wanted to know, well, what standard would they use to ensure that there was some sort of standard in how people deal with financial accounting, they turned to the private sector, and we get the generally accepted accounting practices that actually the private sector developed. So I think the answer to your question, Melissa, is we've got to kind of have a new model of partnership, and this includes with our friends and allies that has always been our greatest advantage, that said, let's start with the values that we share, the outcome that we need, and then be a little bit more open-minded that each player has their own value prop that has to be addressed. The other thing I'd just say is, for the longest time, the US government has stayed out of the standard setting business and left that mostly to industry to establish, and there are good reasons for doing it. We love the private sector and those forces driving. But I think if you look at the international landscape and you look at how some of those governing bodies are being subordinated by interests that are very counter to our values, I think the US government's going to have to get a little bit more engaged into those standard setting bodies. That was another good question. And let's turn to somebody else with a harder question.
Sure. Anthony, you're next up on the slate.
There we go.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which was, when I asked about AI being kind of a black box, you said that, analysts are in some ways, they're come to conclusions which they can't necessarily 100% always explain. And the IC has more comfort with that than we may realize. A lot of intelligence is looking at human motivations, which is an incredibly important but incredibly woolly thing to try and disentangle. When I think about some of the biggest stories we've covered over the past 2 years, the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban takeover, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, two of the big, I think, factors which were perhaps probably not adequately understood ahead of those events was the will to fight of the Afghan army, the will to fight of the Ukrainian army, the will to fight of the Russian army. Analyzing the will to fight of troops of a foreign army is incredibly complex and difficult, nuanced to get at. Is that the kind of task that you think AI can play a role in, or are there just going to be certain things that will always fall to human analysts who can make these very human judgments?
Yeah, no, you weren't kidding. You really did sort of tee up the much harder question. No, I think, look, you've given an example of something that humans should be good at. Humans are very good at assessing the psychological motivations of other people. The best lie detectors in the world are other human beings, and we've evolved for hundreds of thousands or millions of years to be able to do that. What we're not great at doing is assessing how groups of human beings are going to interact, and that's not what we evolved to do. And clearly, there are many examples of us not being able to perform that analysis. And like you say, whether the Afghan people would be willing to, or how long they would be willing to hold out against the Taliban. And you can go back through history of countless examples. So I think that's an example of something we're not great at, and that the IC needs to build tools to get good at. One of the tools that we've done in the past to do that is essentially creating processes and bureaucracies. Think of a group of people in a certain process as almost a prototype form of artificial intelligence in that sense, to check each other's thoughts, to crowdsource against groups of people, to use probability and things like this to our advantage. AI is another tool like that to help individual human beings think in areas that we're not great at thinking of. And I do think we're going to try to get AI to help us answer those questions. Whether this particular generation of AI, the current generation we're at, ChatGPT-4 and some of the other models out there, is good at it, I haven't seen anything yet to tell me that it is particularly good at that. But I do think there's a selection pressure by, the IC to start, but other organizations, companies, for example, to try to figure out, how groups of people react. Look at the finance industry. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that there are some very big hedge funds in the world out there right now trying to train an AI model to figure out how markets are going to react to news, for example, how groups of human beings will react to events. And so there's a huge selection pressure and lots of money to go do that. And so I do think we'll develop over time AI systems that are going to be quite good at that. I think the IC will do it. And I think that they will, if you ask me to predict, will they get better than human beings? Probably, because we're not going to evolve in our brain's ability to think about groups and so forth much more than we are now in the next 10 or 50 years. And our bureaucracies aren't going to evolve that much, but the technology is going to evolve a huge amount. And I think we can't even predict where Gen AI models will be in a year, much less 10. And so I'm pretty sure that we'll get to a point with these models where they're very good at predicting this. Now, of course, adversaries and so forth will know that the models are good at it. They'll use their own models to, then try to, sabotage the thinking, and you get, what some people call kind of this red queen dynamic, where as soon as you get good at something, the environment changes, and now you're not good at it anymore, just like how markets work. So I think there's going to be an ongoing competition as systems get better, and AI systems get better, but then adversaries get better, and there's just going to be this kind of constant competition, and it's going to be fascinating for us all to watch.
That's quite a thought, that AI and these systems are learning faster than humans can, than our own cognition can evolve. We've got some excellent audience questions have come in. Chip, I think I'm going to throw this one to you. This comes from John Horan, who's also in Arlington. We are big in Arlington today, with Arlington Independent Media. John asks that, given that a lot of the information the AI is trained on comes from the very hyperconnected parts of the world, North America, Europe, South Asia, how does this distort the raw material, which is the source of Gen AI? And he uses the example of 23andMe, the genotype service, which was really trained on a lot of data from North Americans and from Western Europe, and so it was trained on a lot of white people, less data from other genetic groups. How do we make sure that, therefore, Gen AI can build a true, accurate picture of the entire world when it's trained on data which is only coming from a portion of the world?
No, that's a great question, and true to form, another complex one. I'll do my best here. I mean, I think it sort of depends on what you'll be asking your AI model to do. The questioner sort of poses sort of know everything or run a model of the world. And certainly that would be impaired if the inputs are limited to only certain societies or parts of the world or certain races and that sort of thing. Couple things to consider. One is sort of the rate of digitization around the globe is continuing to increase apace. So more people are getting online every year. Secondly, these models that we've been talking about over the last 12 to 18 months are large language models, but there are other forms, right? They're multimodal models. They're able to intake, every written book. They can intake images, photographs, all sorts of data, that some of which is hard copy or not just in the digitized textual form. So, their ability to absorb that information is going to continue to grow apace. But I think we'll go through a shakeout period where biases, because of the data that they're built upon, are going to be problematic. And I think that will take, a few years before that really gets sorted out. In the meantime, we'll have to be on guard against it. But great question.
And we have another great question, which comes in from Isabella Lisco, who's in Washington, D.C. with the Medill News Service. Isabella asks a number of questions. I'm going to hone in on one, which is of interest to me, which is about AI surveillance capitalism. So the trade in this kind of technology and the data behind it. And we've already seen this with a lot of privately developed surveillance technologies being developed by one state, being sold to authoritarian governments. Think about facial recognition technology, which is being widely distributed by China across the world. How worried are you about the private sector potentially owning and then selling off massive amounts of data to foreign entities?
So I'll start and Chip, you and Anthony fix it. So one, I don't think there's any putting the genie back in the bottle. So I don't think there's any call from the government that it's going to take away the risks implied in the question and that you state. So one, I think there's some technology answers that said we're going to have to develop some of the capability to be able to identify misuse. I think Melissa's question about how we huddle together for warmth with our friends and allies to make sure that we have some standards for the private sector to understand that they're not playing some random game of the tragedy of the commons where it's somebody else's responsibility, the resources and environment in which we live. And I think it's a little bit the US government leaping into the fray to help give a framework for how you manage risk. So I think the difficulty in the question is that this is one of the things that's really hard for free and open societies, and particularly the kind of democratic capitalism that we practice here, where we so value the independence, but this is actually one that requires shared recognition of an issue and shared responsibility for the outcome and shared benefit from what we do. And then you just have to work on all those fronts to start bringing it together. But again, I will say that information quality in general and ensuring that is something that anybody should want if what they value is free and open societies and the benefit that a default to trust allows. And so better investment in those areas is probably something we need to go alongside with some of the other advancing capabilities.
Chip, Anthony, sorry. Anthony, go ahead.
Well, I'll just add one quick piece of pessimism followed quickly by optimism. I really do think it's dangerous. AI is dangerous, much more so than surveillance or surveillance capitalism. And I think it is hopeless to imagine that any government or any small group of people is going to figure out how to regulate things or how to solve that problem. And that's the pessimism. I think we're doomed for failure if we think about the problem in that sense. The only way to figure it out is going to be not even society level, but kind of global level thinking of how you deal with this. And one piece of optimism I have is that AI is the opposite of nuclear weapons, which were very secret and essentially contained within a couple of governments and, one or two think tanks, like RAND. Now, they did eventually come up with a solution that seems to have worked. AI has gone completely the other direction. It's totally open. And I think, in many ways, people in the intelligence community were the last people to realize how important AI was going to be. People in Silicon Valley knew it way earlier. And that's good because I think it's going to get the maximum number of people on Earth to try to figure out how to solve this problem over time. I don't know that we can imagine what the solution looks like right now. I think it's going to take some time to figure it out. But I do have an optimism that when you get 7 billion people thinking about an existential problem, we'll probably get there.
Just a two-finger interjection for me real quick, just to build on what Anthony was saying. We can go down hundreds of rabbit holes of horrible use cases. But let's also not forget that there'll be hundreds, thousands of terrific use cases, new medicines, new compounds, new technologies enabled by generative AI.
Thank you, Chip. And unusually we are right on time to wrap up today. So I will let you go. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your insights about the challenges and the opportunities of AI. I think you really set out some of the stakes, but also a few notes of optimism in there. So thank you, Chip, for ending us on a positive note. And that's it from us today. It's a rapidly and changing environment, the world of AI, but it's one that we will continue to cover here at Foreign Policy. A huge thanks to SCSP for supporting today's event, and to all of our guests for joining us, and for you at home or work or wherever you are joining us around the world. And a special thanks to those of you who wrote in with questions today. You can watch all of the previous events with SCSP linked right here on our website. You can view all the previous conversations from this series. Stay tuned for updates from us and other upcoming events at foreignpolicy.com/events. That's it from us for now, and thank you so much for joining us today.